Okay, great. I think we're going to go ahead and kick this thing off. Welcome everybody again. My name is Peter. I'm the program director here at Amplify Arts. We're excited to have you join us tonight for our alternate currents panel discussion, DIY or Don't, Artist-Run Spaces and Cultural Institutions with panelists Saralyn Brown, Leydig, Joelle Sandfort, and our moderator, Lillian Snortland. I want to take just a minute to thank the Hitchcock Foundation, the Mammal Foundation, and the Nebraska Arts Council, whose support makes programs like these possible. If you are new to Amplify, if you haven't joined us for a discussion like this before, Amplify's mission is to promote unity, innovation, and progress in the cultural sector. And one program that helps us do that is Alternate Currents. Alternate Currents is kind of a three-pronged program that includes a blog, a discussion series, which is what we're all participating in tonight, and a working group of 10 artists and culture workers who come together and help shape the program and move it forward. Lily, our moderator, is a member of our 2021 Alternate Currents working group, and I just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you for her for all of her incredible work this year. She's moderated a bunch of these discussions. She's contributed some amazing work to a forthcoming publication, and her insight and thoughtfulness and care has really helped shape the content of our discussions this year. So Lily, thank you. You are incredible. We really appreciate it. Our panelists are also incredible. We're really thankful to have them all here and to learn from them. Sarah, Kyle, and Joelle, thank you so much. This is just one panel and kind of a year-long investigation of the future of our cultural institutions and how we can make our cultural institutions more equitable and more just. Our panelists will be in conversation with one another for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open up the floor to questions. But by all means, if you have thoughts or questions before that, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A or the chat. Both functions will be active throughout the discussion. A video and a transcript of our conversation tonight will be available on the Alternate Currents blog in another week or two. So please also feel free to revisit the discussion, leave your comments, and help us keep this conversation going there. Just one more thing. I wanted to mention briefly the applications for our Alternate Currents working group for next year, 2022, are open now through November 28th. And you can find more specific information about the working group and Alternate Currents on our website anytime. It's just www.amplifyarts.org. So thank you again for being here. We really appreciate your support and your participation in critical discussions like this. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lily.
Thanks so much, Peter. I mean, he said it all, but I want to just go ahead and start off with a really brief introduction, just a couple of minutes each. I can go really quickly myself. I work in the nonprofit arts development world. I'm a writer on the side. So this conversation is kind of really talking about both sides of my life and how we can shape those relationships between those groups. And yeah, I'm a member of the Alternate Currents working group. And that's been a really fun opportunity to link, I would say, my social practice, if you can call it that, and my creative practice, and trying to meld those together. I would love to pass it off to Sarah. You're the first on the corner for me. So just introduce yourself with what your background is, what you do now, which is a really broad question, but answer it as you like, and why do you do it?
Oh, great. Hello, everyone. Saralyn Brown. My pronouns are she, hers. I have lived in Omaha most of my life and worked as an artist and educator in Omaha. I got my bachelor in theater performance at UNO, and I got my master's from University of Northern Colorado in theater education. I've worked with either as freelance or as staff with a lot of the nonprofits in Omaha, maybe almost all of them, pretty close, the artistic and theater and performance related ones. I worked primarily for the past 2 decades with Nebraska Shakespeare and created a touring education program with them, and then also a program for gender exploration. Now I work as a freelance artist educator. I'm on the NAC roster. I work with a lot of high schools and middle school students in the realm of gender performance and storytelling. And then at the beginning of March 2020, I leased a small micro theater called the Leavenworth Space on 50th and Leavenworth, determined to do small, intimate theater. And then, you know, the rest of the year happened. And so it was empty and I cried inside of it a lot. But then I found a new life for it. And now it is a house for visual artists and also a platform for new artists and writers to create their own pieces of performance and writing. That's me.
Joelle, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Joelle Sandfort. I'm originally from Lincoln. I graduated from Nebraska Wesleyan with a degree in art and education. I taught high school art classes for 2 years, and then I moved to Omaha around the time when the pandemic was starting. And since then, I worked with the South Omaha Mural Project, and I've done some private art lessons and started a DIY space in my garage within the last few months. And then I'm also a facilitator with the Naturalist School, and I lead poetry and art workshops with them.
Kyle, you're up.
Hi, my name's Kyle Leydig. So my background, I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. I received my BFA in photography and aesthetic theory from Rhode Island School of Design. And I guess since graduating, I've worked as an administrator in arts nonprofits on the East Coast and as an arts writer for a variety of publications. I moved to Omaha about 2.5 years ago, sort of on a whim. And about a year almost to the day ago, I started a art gallery here called Bader-Meinhof. And my work at the gallery has focused on curating a program of artists outside of the Midwest, sort of in an effort to create bridges between our local cultural economy and those abroad. Through the gallery, beyond its exhibition program, I also operate a room and board residency. So I invite artists to come from all parts of the world, stay here, make work, afford them a place to live and access to fabrication resources. And again, in an effort to connect artists from outside and the local community to sort of like a integrated ecosystem of cultural productivity. So yeah, that's me. That's what I do.
Thank you guys. So yeah, now we can move into the, I guess, first stab at this question. I'd like to hear about your experiences with independent, alternative, DIY, or self-run art spaces. So you've all in your introductions sort of talked about either starting one or having like worked in them. And so yeah, I'm curious, yeah, how do you feel about them?
I can start, I guess. It is like independent, alternative, devised work is kind of where I cut my teeth after I graduated from UNO. There was, so this is a while ago, this is 17 years ago, there was this culture in the theater community of self-production. There was a lot of artists that were working on writing their own work, producing their own work, a lot of drive towards like devised theater. And I feel like I never got my master's in theater performance, but I feel like in that work after my undergrad, I really learned a lot of what I could have learned in a master's program. And I looked towards starting the Leavenworth space and starting that sort of relationship with the community, because I haven't seen that lately. Like a lot of the theaters that were creating independently, a lot of artists that were kind of doing some of the grassroots production of more the riskier theater just isn't really happening in Omaha right now. So trying to use this small space as a really easy and affordable way to allow people to start to workshop and navigate and curate their own kind of artistic voice, because I feel like in the past decade or so, it's started to lessen those the platforms that allow young artists, new artists, or just people who want to explore. There's not really a platform for that. There's not a venue for that. So that is something that I started out and I kind of cut my teeth on, and I don't know what type of artist I would be if I wouldn't have had those opportunities. So looking towards offering those to other people as well.
Yeah, Joelle, did you have something to say? It looks like you went off mute.
Yeah. So I feel like similar to what Sarah was saying, in Lincoln, I was surrounded by a lot of people who were starting their own DIY projects of different sorts. There was one project that was in a church, like in an old church. They would host like music events, and sometimes there would be exhibitions. And so it was kind of like looking at those experiences and wondering if I could do something like that myself. And so one of my friends at the time that I was also living with, we were talking about how we wanted to do something like that eventually, where we started some kind of space. And then we decided, like, why do we have to wait? We can just do this now. And so we just kind of found a studio space and just started renting it out and going from there. But it really was inspired by seeing a lot of the other DIY spaces in Lincoln, and also some of the other places that I had visited. Like one time in Minneapolis, I was with a school group there, and we ended up going to someone's like garage gallery show. And so that's kind of where I was like, oh, like we can show art pretty much wherever. It doesn't just have to be in this white cube space. And I did work at my school's gallery during college as well. So I had like experience from there. And so it was fun to kind of take that experience and then also like bring it into more of the DIY scene.
I guess my background coming out of Philadelphia, which sort of has a long history of sort of like renegade or like ostensibly like punk or off kilter exhibition spaces. I sort of growing up took a lot of cues from alternative art spaces across the country. I know that I'm going to drop a few links into the chat so that we have a common point of reference. One based out of New York, which ostensibly is sort of alternative, but ended up sort of becoming a little bit more institutionalized, is a now defunct project called Real Fine Arts. I'm posting a link to like a sort of curated selection of their projects. And that was like a space run out of Brooklyn that sort of engaged with more horizontally like leveled kind of like tier of artist, in that they worked with emerging artists, but then also displayed sort of more institutionally validated or verified artists, and kind of like we're able to create a really unique like social ecosystem there. Another space that I've been very inspired by growing up and continually is this space in Portland, Oregon called Yale Union. And so this is a nonprofit, sort of a little bit like maybe more institutional in its like scope, but it was run by this artist Flint Jameson, and they did an incredible job of presenting, you know, sort of like they maintain a sort of renegade spirit about their program, showing a lot of work from Japan, a lot of work from sort of relevant but like off the beaten path artists in the States, and also an interesting model in terms of I think we'll end up getting here, but in terms of like queering institutional strategies. They recently ceded their land to the local indigenous people, and so now Yale Union is no longer, but the space itself that housed the nonprofit is going to be a museum for for like for the indigenous cultures in Portland. And so I think that not only did they kind of like show a pretty expansive and exciting way to take a look at curatorial programming, but also I think ethical sort of community-based practices in their wake. So those are some of just two examples of spaces that I find interesting. But my own engagement has always been sort of like curating shows at different spaces, whether it's like nomadic curatorial projects like Proxy and Providence, or just doing stuff my freshman year at film school in Philadelphia in my living room, which I guess is not so different from what I'm doing now, which is running a gallery out of my home. So yeah, that's maybe a brief summation of my engagement with sort of alternative spaces.
It's funny that I think both Joelle and Kyle mentioned something like starting from just, you know, your living room or your like your small space, but somehow wanting to invite people in. That was also my first interaction with the idea of like DIY, was like my friends have just putting stuff up on the walls kind of jokingly, but creating a full gallery experience out of it. And yes, it was a bit of a joke, but they went through the effort, and it made me realize like that was as much fun to me as walking into like a gallery, because it was about the people. It wasn't just about what we were looking at. And then I started looking more into that, and I found this really lovely gallery. I unfortunately did not get to see it before it closed, but it was called the Nook Gallery. And that was a space that was literally just 2 benches and a table. And it's the idea of just you coming together in a very like small scale, but being able to address art and life. And I think that that is sort of, for me at least, where I think DIY spaces and like independently run spaces, smaller spaces, can do what institutions are less able to do. Yeah, I don't know. That is, I think, why I enjoy work outside of institutions a bit more. I think that it touches on the human part, and it can expand further in a really nice way. It's not just consuming art, it's expanding like what it means to be human and what it means to have a connection with another person. But Kyle also made me think of a certain question that's a bit down the line, but I think we can go ahead and dive into it, which was talking about how self-run spaces can question and queer sort of established institutional hierarchies. So I think some examples of that would be the professionalization of roles in cultural institutions. So I think Joelle, that was Sarah. Sarah, you mentioned that the idea that people, if they are not fully professional and they're just starting out, just learning, just experimenting, there isn't really space for that. And so I think that this is a great place to start this conversation. Is, you know, professionalization can lead to weird hierarchies. I think there's also just the idea of a top-down style of governance. So you'll have like your executives on the top, you'll get down in the managers, trickle down, and then the artists somehow end up falling at the bottom of the pyramid, which is weird because they are the ones who are really forwarding the mission of the institution a lot of the time. And so I was curious if we could talk a little bit about ways to overwrite those institutional hierarchies. And that might be in a self-run smaller space, but if you want to be imaginative, like how can you see that really expanding into like the whole cultural ecosystem? Like what would happen if that got shaken up? I don't know if anyone immediately has an idea, but I saw Sarah like nodding. Anyway, so you want to start, Sarah?
Yeah, I think if this pandemic has taught us anything, seeing what happened with all the institutions having to go dark, and for the most part, the people who were cut loose were the artists. The people who had to go on unemployment were the artists, and of course, there were organizations were cutting and slashing everywhere, but it was administrative. It was like the higher level positions were the ones that were protected and were kept around, which I do understand, having worked for nonprofits, that like the structure of that is important. And if that isn't in place, then the organization isn't there to hire the artists. But I just feel like kind of the whole structure of nonprofit, what we could see from this last year is kind of opposite, and it should be kind of like tilted in giving ownership and leadership to the people who are providing the reason why the building is there and the reason why the administration is there. There are a few theaters that I've noticed kind of taking the opportunity, and I'm not sure if this is happening in other art forms as well, but there are a few theaters that are American Shakespeare Theater is one of them, that is taking their artistic director position, which is usually, you know, one of the top positions of the organization, and are splitting it amongst multiple artists. So actors or artists that have been with the company for many years, they're now experimenting with allowing that higher position to be one that is run by the artists, that is run by those people who have had the experience of being the lower ones in the ranking, and giving it to multiple people. So it's not just one artist that's been given this position. And then of course you're put in this cog of this organization, and it's very hard to do any sort of change if you don't have the support of the people around you. So yeah, I think I'm seeing sparks of it happen because of this past 18 months, where we started to really see the inequities between arts and administration in nonprofits.
Kyle, I know that you had brought up that specific organization that was really doing well, or had certain clear techniques to work through those hierarchies. I was wondering if there were others on that list. I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I guess I dropped a few other links into the chat. Really, not a comprehensive list, but just, I guess, a couple of different like alternative projects. One is this project called Bedside Love Affair, which was run by an artist, Jared Madeir, out of his like RV. So he would drive it around Brooklyn and curated work that of, you know, emerging artists that sort of had like a specific anti-institutional like take, whether it be through materials or like content that was sort of like a little edgier or a little less like clean or pat, less white cube. And similarly, I also added this gallery that an artist, Aaron Noah Graham, former student at Cooper Union, incredible artist. He bought a U-Haul truck and ran exhibitions out of there and would park it in Chelsea and like arts districts, but also in strange parts of the city in New York. And I guess like sort of to piggyback on what Sarah was saying, if there's one thing that I've really noticed or a change I've observed in the cultural productivity, like coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been a sudden emergence of alternative spaces, not just nationally, but internationally. People, I think, seizing upon what was already taking place, but sort of COVID and varying degrees of quarantine and social isolation sort of like reinforced and pushed across the threshold, which is the leveling or horizontal flattening of space, meaning that you don't need to be present necessarily to be engaged in a cultural discourse, and subsequently like artists and people who want to organize art to be seen didn't need physical bodies in the way that for historically, you know, art exhibition has sort of demanded. And so I think this, like, instead of being sort of oppressed or sort of like stifled by these like like frustrating social conditions, it gave like a sort of a landscape in which to seize unique spaces, those that are accessible, whether because it's financially feasible or it's like available in some other capacity, and gave an opportunity to BCs to realize projects in spaces that might have otherwise not been considered. And so that's been something that's been really exciting to observe and kind of see these spaces not only be taken seriously, but really thrive in and social. That's, I mean, I guess something that is like temporally relevant to us, but also is an exciting model to move forward that perhaps, Field of Dreams, you know, if you build it, it could be in your garage, Joelle, or it could be in your living room, but they will come in one form or another.
Kind of going along with that idea of more accessibility to these spaces, I think of kind of this trend in like digital art spaces that's been happening. And like, for example, like Ghost Gallery that Ian Treadway had started, which is no longer still functioning, but just creating, I mean, it's not the same experience to see artwork online as it is to go to a physical space, but trying to get those images out and more accessible to people, I think is another way to do that, to kind of engage with that. And in terms of like queering institutions, something that I've thought of, and I don't have any examples of any institutions that are actually doing this right now, and that might just be because I haven't done enough research, but I would love to see a curator in an institution reaching out to like community members who aren't that experienced with curation, and really like working with them to come up with an idea for a show that really can connect with the community or engage with local artists, or like bridge like local and regional or national artists. I think that would be really an interesting way of queering that kind of space.
So that seems like an advantage that maybe an independently run or not an independently run organization, however you want to phrase it, has over a museum or an exhibition gallery or university. So I guess I'm wondering, what other advantages do you see in those self-run spaces? Like why is that? And then we've sort of already began to start like talk about this, but I would love some like more specifics, maybe even from a financial standpoint, because I feel like people automatically assume that financially it would actually be a larger organization that would be benefiting from that system. But is there any financial gain or benefit to being smaller? Are you able to be more nimble? Are you able to have more connection to the community? Can you get around some of the weird I don't know, pitfalls that nonprofits have just legally?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I got distracted. My roommate came in. She didn't know I was up here. I'm gonna think on that for a second.
I guess I can maybe answer or speak to those questions. I think generally, or like more broadly speaking, in my opinion, self-run spaces are like better equipped to manifest individualized support, in that they're more immediately able to address specific needs of artists in a way that's like plastic or sort of empathetically flexible. And I think through this kind of individualized, like interpersonal connection, there's a distinctly human experience of space and like a locality that that can create a bond and be a service like a bridge to the local community and culture. And also, you know, in some ways we have a couple different models of residency programs locally, but I think that when spaces can foster a very, I don't know, like again, an intimate connection with artists and the locality, that it holds the potential to kind of, for a continued relationship, essentially, one that can combat the kind of transitory or temporary participation that sometimes can plague larger institutions and residency programs. You know, they're here for a couple of months and then they're gone. Or like, you know, yeah, I might not go there, but maybe I will. There was a project a while back where Theaster Gates came into the community in North Omaha and sort of built a center, like community center, to kind of like engage and enrich the local community. And that I think it was funded through like nonprofit collaboration, but the building that was utilized now sits vacant. And I think that, I mean, the project was like really important at the time, but without sort of a continued narrative, without continued participation with the people who come into a space, come into a community, it's kind of hard to gain traction. So I think self-run spaces are uniquely privileged in their ability to foster and maintain those connections.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of that, just like keeping yourself low to the ground keeps you focused on the art and on the artist. Like I feel like the larger you get, the more budget you need for all of those things. So being self-run, being your own entity, you're so much more flexible. You're able to adjust to the needs of the community or the needs of the artist. And I feel like there is, I mean, obviously less overhead and things like that, but also so less people to answer to. You don't have a board, you don't have a staff that you have to run everything through. So everything can happen so much quicker, and things can be a little bit more, can be pushing the envelope a little bit more, because you don't have to go through all of the chains of command that you would with a nonprofit or a larger organization. So yeah, I feel like you're just a bit more nimble, and especially when you're talking about art and artists, like that's where the good, the important, the challenging work thrives when it doesn't have those types of restrictions placed upon it. So yeah, I think it allows you some really great flexibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really great pathway to another part of this conversation, which is, I think about those barriers that you are alluding to, Sarah. I think that there's a particular reference that we all have from the Union for Contemporary Arts, the Radical Arts program. So we looked into that a little bit before this conversation, and it is the idea of like radical hospitality. It's moving beyond just art and like visualizing and seeing, and moving into either virtual services or moving even past that to like the next rung, which is service to your community in ways that you might not even connect to art. So they were working with like food scarcity and things like that. So it's sort of, I would say, like rippling out. And I think that sometimes independent run spaces, because they have that connection, that locality, like Kyle mentioned, they are really in touch with what the community needs as human beings, because art for art's sake isn't really particularly, in my opinion, it's not particularly interesting or meaningful, you know, when you get down to it. And so I would love to hear if you have other examples in your heads of instances where either you've worked in the sort of like rippling out services yourself, or you've seen other institutions or self-run spaces really doing that well, and why that's important.
Yeah, I think just briefly, I think the few experiences that I've had, even within this past 18 months of not being able to do a ton, but trying to do what we can, just even having the space, having the Leavenworth space, the ripple effect of like mentorship, the idea of this is a space that you can come to and can find someone that is going to be able to help you figure out how to self-produce, or help you figure out what the next step is. And then also the idea of like continued training that is outside of university or outside of the professional status. and looking for something that can supplement that sort of education in a much smaller, intimate, one-on-one sort of relationship. And again, because it is so small and has like the smaller financial needs, you're able to look at each individual person who walks through the door and what you can do for them, rather than having to figure out how you're going to have a class for 30 people because you need to get the tuition, because you need to pay all of the people. So it just gives you so much more. It allows you, like you were saying before, it allows you to keep that kind of human connection and human growth. And that's something that I found that I was surprised to find people were really interested in this community, and that this small building kind of started to provide those opportunities.
And I think especially with the pandemic and how we were prevented for so long from gathering, just being able to host events now and have people come and be together and share space, it really does feel like a celebration. So like having food and making sure that people are comfortable and feeling welcomed in a space, I think is something that is pretty rare in like a bigger institution, where they're really just focused on how many people are walking through the door. And with having a smaller space, you can really just focus on connecting with someone. Like this last show that I had at the Fleabane Gallery, that Jasmine Purcell was the artist. She's a Lincoln filmmaker, but I invited the neighbors, which I hadn't done for the first showing. And I was really glad that I did, because one of them showed up and he had never been to an art event before, but he was just really grateful to have been invited and to be able to connect with his neighbors. And he really enjoyed the experience. And it was cool because now I feel like we're connected, and we lived next to each other for like a year and hadn't even really spoke until that moment. And so that was really special, and I think pretty uncommon in larger spaces.
Yeah, I guess I might not have like anything radical to add, but Joelle, your comment about engaging with your neighbors is something that like I find quite resonant. Seeing that like the gallery is run out of my home, I do live in a residential neighborhood. But more generally and broadly speaking, I think some of the most profound and frankly the most interesting conversations and experiences shared that I've had around art have always been with non-practitioners, people who aren't artists, who don't elect to go to art exhibitions, who may not even be like, you know, particularly like culturally engaged in the traditional sense. They might not go to the theater, they, you know, and I think there's often this dynamic where, which maybe ties into kind of like the discourses around cultural productivity, which is that learned perspectives or perspectives that come from a specific and specialized knowledge set are often privileged. Like we are talking here about this because there is some type of, there's like some pedigree, right? We're involved in alternative spaces, we run spaces, we're engaged with arts in the community. But I found the most inspiring conversations to be with my neighbor across the street, this 85-year-old woman, Mary, who she runs a food bank, is deeply engaged in the community in a way that's extremely self-defined and really kind of inspiring. And, you know, she's not an art critic or a theorist or an artist proper, but her insights on some of the exhibitions have been the most like moving and kind of thought-provoking. And I think that when you run an alternative space, you kind of open a door to a really like uncontrollable kind of like presence. You don't know who's going to walk through the door. It might not be desired at all. You know, it might be someone who, yeah, it could be a negative input, but all too often I found it to be like really refreshing and unique perspectives from people who I never would have maybe anticipated otherwise. And I think in some ways that's the most radical thing art can do, is congeal an uncommon audience and allow space for conversation and dialogue to happen. And I think by nature, alternative spaces are sort of preternatural, or like sort of like predisposed to those interactions, and something that I appreciate.
Yeah, I think for me that did remind me that there is sort of a, I guess, prestige that sometimes goes along with art in general. But when you get down to it, like, art is about survival. It's about expressing your community or representing yourself in a way that maybe you literally can't. Like, I was thinking of this recent exhibition. I live in Baltimore now. I think I mentioned that, but I went to a retrospective of this experimental, they call it a cabaret. It's more of just like an experimental art space. And just reading some of those panels and realizing, like, this was the only space where people could be themselves safely. And I think that we sometimes forget that how critical and crucial those countercultural spaces are to a community and to a city. Like, I genuinely believe they are the lifeblood of a city. So whenever I go somewhere new, I'm not trying to go to like the biggest museum. I'm trying to find those little like nooks and crannies where people really are able to like be themselves and also be the most experimental. So I just wanted to say that as a reminder to myself and anyone listening, like, it is important that these spaces exist. I'm going to, really quick, we can continue on this line of thinking too, but I just wanted to offer a moment for the audience to type anything in the chat question wise, but usually that takes a few minutes, so we can continue speaking, but drop stuff in the chat.
I just wanted to bounce off what you said, Lillian, and kind of pull back something that I said earlier on, was the idea of like how important, like what you seek out when you go to a new community and those like smaller galleries. And that's why I think like the in the current theater culture, performance culture in Omaha, those small theaters, those kind of grassroots theaters aren't really present and aren't really there. And there are a bunch of spaces like we were saying, there's kind of these new venues, but there's not the tools of self-production haven't been cultivated in the community. And so providing the space is wonderful, but also providing all of those tools in order to do self-production. And that's something that I feel is so important to the broader arts community. And in order for Omaha to also have the depth of experience, you have to have those smaller performance experiences, those more bare bones, riskier, grittier storytelling experiences. And right now I'm not seeing a ton of that in Omaha.
Did you guys have anything else to add? If not, I can ask another question. Okay, well, let's move on to a different question then. Sorry, I've been bouncing around my document, so let's see. You've really managed to touch most of the questions, which is amazing. I mean, I guess I would love to circle back on maybe the idea of elitism and like how you manage to get away from elitism in your spaces, whether that's like, yeah, probably just in your self-run work or in interactions with people as you like move through the art world. It's pretty difficult to like kind of shed that feeling. And so I'm curious, how do you see that happening in your personal lives? And how would you recommend that institutions do the same? Or is it really not in their purview to do that? Like, would it be authentic if they did?
Well, I think it's like it's a museum's job to kind of reflect what's happening in the culture. And I think that there is a lot of like it's more of like the fine art and the high art that gets like exhibited in these spaces, but there's such a like treasure trove of like lower forms of art that I think are really important to a lot of people. And so I think it would be interesting for museums to question like what exactly they're showing and why they're showing it. Like, are they just trying to show all of the like hot artists, or are they willing to take a risk and show an artist that might not be like good or be popular, but just is like important to a certain group of people?
I think that the question about elitism and sort of cultivating a more open cultural sphere is one that really kind of, there's not a one way to answer it for all spaces and all localities. So I think it has to be addressed kind of specifically and locally first. Since moving here, one of the first things that I really noticed was that the same artists kept getting shown at all of the local galleries. It was sort of, I mean, I had only been here really for about a year, and I had already seen like 2 or 3 artists be shown more than once at spaces. And I sort of got the feeling that there was like an interior kind of hierarchy, while it might not be elitist in the sense of like a, you know, like an international, like global art economy. I did feel as though there was some kind of Omaha hierarchy taking place, and that certain voices were being amplified and sort of like reiterated over and over and over again. And I think that was one of the things that sort of made me feel like it was necessary and important to step in and create a space that was kind of doing something different, not showing the same artist that everyone knows like a couple months after. And while it might not be often perceived as elitist, it is about like there is like a kind of cultural clout, or, you know, Omaha famous, or, and insert any city in front of that. There is a internal hierarchy that artists and creators work through to kind of like gain exposure and sort of gain importance within their local creative communities. And I think that's something that, I don't know, I think that that's a problem that could be addressed through a variety of means, but one that I find fairly inspiring is like opening, like is encouraging local cultural workers or artists to be more open to influences outside of their local community. It's so important to support local artists and to really provide robust resources for like your local cultural economy. But I think that when that's the stopping point, you create a condition that causes, like, gives way to like brain drain, for instance, where artists reach a certain point and they find themselves wanting more. They find themselves migrating to larger cultural centers like Chicago or New York or LA. And I think that by creating a more open and variated ecosystem, by bringing in artists from outside and trying to empower and connect local artists to a greater kind of like cultural discourse, you can create conditions where people are like, oh, there's opportunities here, but there's also avenues for connecting with the world beyond that would allow for a more settled and more diverse cultural community and dialogue to exist. And I think that's one way that self-run spaces can help to combat both an exodus from like regional cultural communities, and also, you know, elevate and extend the reach and importance of their local economy to one that's broader and touches different cultural spaces.
Yeah, I agree with all that. The one thing that you said, Lillian, that I wanted to kind of comment on was the idea of larger institutions participating in this like amplification of artists. Is that something that's disingenuous? Are they able to do it? I think they should do it regardless. Like, even if it is a little fake or a little false, like, I feel these larger institutions have such a responsibility to their communities and to their local artists, that even if it is like, oh, well, clearly they're just doing this because they're a big institution and they should, yeah, then they should do it. So like it might feel a little fake or a little false, but it is, it's offering opportunity, it's offering exposure, it's offering highlighting artists that we might not, like what Joelle was saying, like that we might not think are like the high art that would normally be supported by these larger institutions. I think it is their responsibility to their community, whether it is genuine or not. I think they got to do it.
Is there some kind of collaboration that you have seen or could foresee between some of these more self-run spaces and institutions? Like, have you seen that come to fruition before? Because yeah, part of this conversation was trying to figure out what the relationship between those two types of organizations could be in the future, ideally, and what you see now.
Well, I think a primary example would be what no longer exists, but with the Bemis, they used to have, where their current music program or sound program is located, they used to have a space for sort of like alternative or less like institutionalized art to take place. Why they abandoned that for the sound program is like not for me to say, but I think that it's sort of like a yawning chasm in their relevance to like a local cultural economy, in that there was so much potential that was held, and so much possibility for a significant arts organization like that to have a residency program which engages sort of like an international like arts community, have their own programming on the first floor, but then have a space where you can have more flexibility, more space for like we mentioned, like experimental work or work that doesn't exist within a more rigid like art market kind of dialectic. And I agree with Sarah that there's really like, we're talking about self-run spaces. It's like, you know, I deliver groceries and do freelance design work to facilitate the exhibition program here. But with the operating budgets that some of these places have going on, I really wonder like where it's getting spent and what the priorities are in these spaces. While also empathizing sort of in a certain way at the peril, or not perils, but sort of the energy that it takes to engage with a community. When you've got those kinds of resources to throw at it, it's like, well, okay, like the priorities and the kind of implicit privilege and like blind oversight that's taking place becomes a lot more apparent. And I think the Bemis is a really good example of a place that needs to be like questioning the way that it's allocating its resources. I found the Union to be maybe a much more inspiring space in the way that they allocate their programming to sort of be divided between like supporting local artists and then bringing also in national artists in a way that feels integrated as well. I think you have two very strong dialects. You have the Jocelyn, which is like a marble building. And then you have like the Bemis and the Union as these two different models for how arts nonprofit and contemporary art can be contextualized and engaged in a contemporary community focused way. And I think there's, yeah, I think, I don't know. With Arts Omaha and like the sort of ripples that came from spotlighting the gross inequity in terms of arts funding and how that's distributed, and then how that trickles down to community and cultural programming. I agree with Sarah, and I think it should be underlined that providing space for more flexible, for more expansive and experimental work that brings the community in without relinquishing any of the kind of standard, or like, you know, it can be high quality while also being open. And I think that that's something that I would encourage local institutions to kind of investigate and try to reallocate their attention to. Sorry, a lot of words.
Yeah, well, that made me think of a couple of different directions that we could go with this sort of final question. One comment that did come up in the chat that I think is worth mentioning, sort of, it's almost about the life cycle of, I think, the DIY sphere is someone thinks that the Bemis Underground, which was that location that you're talking about, Kyle, that showed more more local artists, that was run by people who spun off into different organizations in Omaha. And I feel like that is something that I noticed a lot when I lived there. Is it seemed as if everyone kind of started in one place and then honed their own visions and spread out. And I think that there's something really interesting, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily a good sign for the ecosystem or not. I would have to look into it, but I think that that's something really special where it's like you're sort of honing your personalized craft of how you see that art can interact with your community. And I will say I worked at Bemis, so like full disclosure, but so I was there for sort of the implementation of the sound program. And so I can't speak to any of the context, but I can say that from a just programmatic standpoint, I've never been more inspired by sound than some of the people that they did bring, because it was an incredibly diverse group of people. So, but you're right, it wasn't necessarily locally based. And I think that there is still, like you said, a chasm that's left behind a little bit. And so, but I just wanted to say my 2 cents about the merits of the program, but point taken about the locality issue. I think that's a good point. And then I guess a final question that is just so uninspiring after everything we've said, but I think is important to sort of think about is, how are you guys keeping the lights on financially? Because like you are not having necessarily the access to the same grants, the same sponsors, you don't have your board members paying in to keep things moving. I think as we in our own, whether you're from Omaha or you're in Baltimore or wherever you are in the world watching this, like knowing how you can support those smaller organizations and self-run spaces if you're interested is important. So yeah, that's my final question.
I can go first. When I was in college, the space that Gabriella Parsons and I ran, called the Mez, was donation and volunteer based. And so, I mean, we put on lots of different, like a variety of programs. There was music, poetry, performance, theater, and then we would have exhibitions. And for all of those programs, we would have a tip jar out. I think that's pretty common at like a concert, but even for like an exhibition. And then part of those funds would go to like paying for the snacks or towards our rent. And then a lot of it was ideally going towards the artists. And then whatever they sold in the space was theirs to keep. Unless they wanted to make a donation. It was not like a contract or commission space. So a lot of it was like just out of our own pockets, but it was like something that we wanted to do to host that space. And then with Fleabane Gallery, I don't use this space other than for storage, and I'm already paying rent on my house. So it really just is coming out of my own funds.
Badermine we have an OnlyFans, so that's like really mostly how we subsidize our program. Similar to Joelle, the idea of folding your living expenses and running a gallery into one lump sum is something that was like an early strategic decision born totally out of necessity. I'm living in a duplex, and I suddenly realized, oh wow, there's a lot of space here. This is like too much space. Like maybe this could accommodate, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2 floors. This could accommodate like a gallery and also quarters for artists and residents to come in. And I just like, if I want to keep living here in a home, then I will continue to pay it. And as long as I am living here, there's a gallery. And that, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've worked myself into a closet, literally, but it also really kind of tones down the pressure that comes with renting a space outside of where you live that all too often is what becomes prohibitive in running a program. It's one thing to rent a space, but all of the inherited costs with putting on exhibitions, it's a lot of money, but it's also a lot of time and energy. And that's a cost that is often overlooked. People come out to exhibitions and I think there's a certain level of appreciation, but outside of this most recent show, which is photographs on a wall, everything has like pretty much consumed my life. And so I think keeping the lights on or conversations around that, I don't know. I think it's important for people watching this and for people generally to understand that to run a really serious, thoughtful, and ambitious program, it really takes a lot of life. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of work. And when you show up to an opening, you're seeing like the 1% of what that takes. And I think that operating in a self-run space, kind of like what we talked about at the beginning, it's like operating within certain strictures, right? You have less access to financial support through institutions, but in that like constraint, you also have agility to be able to be like, okay, this is what I can live with. Like, no, I can't fit that in my garage, so we won't be showing that giant boulder. In the same way that you're like, oh yeah, I don't have that money to frame 500 photographs. And also I don't have, you know what you have and you know what you can live with. And this allows you an agility to make decisions, and also like, I don't know, I guess requires you to engage in a bit of self-care as you like manage both your life and your, your cultural productivity.
Well, we're coming up on time. Sarah, if you want to answer this.
I was just gonna say ditto to those things. Same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Well, in these final, I'm gonna say another 5 minutes, just to give you all time if you would like this space to share any final thoughts, anything that this sparked, anything you want people to leave thinking about. And then if you have any upcoming events that you'd like to share, please let us know. So I don't know, Sarah, did you want to jump in with anything?
No, thank you. I'm very glad to have been here and to have chatted and learned from all of you. But no, what we're working on right now is all in-house stuff. Excited to see what comes out of it.
Joelle, you have anything coming up?
Well, so we're gonna close down for the winter, but in March, there'll be Quentin Fortney, who's a photographer also out of Lincoln, will be having an exhibition. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, I'm so glad to have been here tonight, and thank you.
Yeah, this was a great talk. It was really nice to hear about, all of your perspectives on this stuff. And I guess I'm excited to hear the rest of the program of conversations around institutional futures that Amplify is putting on. As far as the gallery, right now we have a show of Providence-based artist Drew Healy up currently, photographs of sort of sculptural installations that will run through December 3rd. And then after that, we'll be having an opening beginning of the new year of Midwest-based artist Love Poem, a series of photographs, and yeah, excited for the year of programming ahead, and yeah, excited for continued community engagement. So to this and more.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, Joelle, Kyle. Like, this was so fun hearing, and also it makes me nostalgic for Omaha. It makes me miss it a lot. So thank you for reminding me of what a really special place that city is. So I guess I will sign off. Thank you everyone for coming and listening. Look on the Amplify blog, probably like a week after, I think it's usually been. There will be a transcript of it. So yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.